The glacier had always been a place people visited for its beauty, not its danger. And in the summer of 2014, southern Iceland felt unusually calm. The sky was clear, the winds were low, and visibility stretched for miles over the white, rolling ice. It was the kind of day tour guides loved, easy, predictable, uneventful. A day where no one imagined disaster could take root. 5 tourists gathered at the base lodge that morning, excited for the guided glacier hike they had booked weeks in advance. 2 of them were sisters from the United States, 21 and 23 years old, traveling through Europe before one of them started medical school. Their parents later said they had always been inseparable, one impulsive, one careful, both trusting each other more than anyone else in the world. The second pair was a married couple from Germany, celebrating their 10th anniversary. They were experienced hikers, familiar with ice terrain, and had chosen this tour precisely because it wasn't considered dangerous. And the 5th traveler was a quiet man from Japan, a landscape photographer who had been staying in Iceland for nearly a month, chasing the perfect series of glacier shots. He rarely spoke, but those who met him described him as gentle, precise, always observant. Their guide that day was local 42 years old, calm, methodical, with more than a decade of experience. He had led hundreds of tourists safely across the same paths. If anyone could read a glacier, it was him. The hike began at noon. The group clipped into safety ropes, adjusted their crampons, and headed out just as the sun softened the upper layers of ice. Nothing felt unusual. In fact, several tourists on earlier tours later reported that it was one of the most peaceful days they'd ever seen on the glacier. The group was expected back by 4:30 p.m., but at 3:55 p.m., radio communication with their guide suddenly cut off. Staff at the base lodge first assumed it was a simple interference issue. Radio blackouts happened occasionally. Deep ridges and ice walls could distort signals, but after several attempts to reconnect, unease settled in. The guide was known for checking in on time, sometimes early, and he always warned the lodge if the group was running behind. By 5 p.m., when the group still hadn't returned, the lodge manager called Icelandic Search and Rescue. Within an hour, the first team was on the ice. They followed the typical route, the same safe pathway all guides used, and for the first half-mile, everything looked normal. The ice was undisturbed, the ridges unchanged. But when searchers approached the deep blue field near the glacier's interior, they expected to find crampon marks, rope drag, or footprints. Instead, the surface looked clean, fresh, almost untouched. It was as if no one had walked there at all. Fog began forming quickly, an eerie, fast-moving sheet that crawled over the glacier from the west. Within minutes, it reduced visibility to less than 20 feet. This wasn't unusual for Iceland, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Crevasses could be hidden inches beneath powder-frosted surfaces. One step in the wrong direction, and a rescuer could vanish as easily as the tourists had. Still, the teams pressed forward, shouting names into the fog, listening for echoes bouncing off the ice walls. They found nothing. Night temperatures dropped sharply. The search paused, then resumed at first light. By the second day, more teams arrived from Reykjavik, equipped with drones, ground-penetrating radar, and thermal scanners. They widened the search beyond the guide's typical route. Crevasses were probed, moulins were surveyed, and every suspicious shadow was investigated with ropes and sensors. Helicopters scanned from above, though fog patterns continued to interrupt coverage. And yet, not a single piece of evidence surfaced. No broken equipment, no backpack, no glove, no rope fiber, not even a misplaced crampon spike. Investigators began to focus on one chilling possibility: that the group had slipped into a hidden moulin, an ice shaft formed when meltwater carves a vertical tunnel deep into the glacier. These openings can be impossible to see from above, disguised by thin snow layers. Once someone falls in, the icy walls are slick and unforgiving, and the drop can extend hundreds of feet. But even that explanation came with problem. When climbers fall into a moulin or crevasse, they usually leave traces: rope tension marks, scuffing along the ice edge, gear ripped or scraped during the descent. Nothing like that appeared anywhere along the ridge. The area looked immaculate, almost eerily so. By the 4th day, search teams had combed nearly every accessible section. The fog finally lifted, giving them a clear aerial view for the first time since the disappearance. They expected to see some sign, a collapsed snow bridge, a gap, even the faint outline of a slide pattern. The glacier remained pristine. The guide's radio was the only item the rescue teams hoped to pick up via signal scanning, but it appeared offline from the moment communication dropped. That alone baffled authorities. Radios didn't simply shut off unless destroyed, submerged deep underwater, or crushed. The families of the missing began arriving in Iceland 2 days later. The American parents sat quietly in the lodge, watching every rescuer come in and out, waiting for someone to say they found a clue, anything to indicate the sisters had been there. The German couple's relatives insisted the pair must have been alive for hours after radio silence, convinced they would never have taken risks. The Japanese embassy assisted in the search for their missing citizen, though even they admitted privately that the lack of evidence felt unnatural. By the end of the first week, search crews had investigated every crevasse large enough to fit even a single person. Nothing was inside. Sensors found no heat signatures, no metal reflections, no buried objects. Drones captured high-resolution thermal images, but all they showed was the cold, shifting landscape of the glacier. Authorities were forced to consider the unthinkable, that the group had been swallowed by the glacier in a way no one had seen before. Glaciers move slowly, sometimes only inches per day, sometimes several feet. But they move with relentless pressure. Anything that falls into their interior is gradually dragged deeper, compressed, and carried south over the years, entombed in layers of accumulating ice. It was possible the tourists had slipped into a sealed chamber or fissure, an area radar couldn't reach. If that was the case, they would not resurface for years, maybe decades, until the glacier melted enough to reveal what it had taken. The official investigation concluded after 19 days. Authorities suggested the group most likely fell into a concealed moulin or deep crevasse that collapsed behind them, though they admitted there was no physical evidence to support this theory. It was, in their own words, the most complete disappearance ever recorded on an Icelandic glacier. Families returned home with no remains, no belongings, not even a single photo recovered from the Japanese traveler's camera. Locals began referring to the glacier as a place that had swallowed 5 people whole. And each winter, as temperatures cooled and the glacier shifted south by a few meters, people wondered how far the missing hikers had traveled beneath its surface. The ice moved like a slow conveyor belt, steady, silent, carrying its secrets deeper every year. No one expected that the glacier would eventually give something back, but 9 years later, it did. And what scientists found left everyone speechless. In the first 48 hours after the 5 tourists vanished, rescuers moved with urgency and purpose, still believing they were searching for people who might be alive, trapped, or injured somewhere on the glacier. But as the days stretched on, the operation grew far beyond a routine emergency response. It became one of the largest, most complex glacier searches Iceland had seen in decades, an effort that would pull in dozens of specialists, advanced equipment, and eventually, questions no one could answer. Teams began by retracing the exact route the guide was expected to follow, starting from the base lodge and working upward. Every hike on that glacier left some trace, a heel mark, a pole jab, a crampon puncture in softened ice. But like the first responders before them, the larger search crews found nothing. It was as if 5 adults and a fully equipped guide had never even stepped foot beyond that ridge. Even when they broadened the search outward, sweeping areas far off the standard path, the glacier remained disturbingly clean. Rescuers brought in ice tunnel experts, people who had spent years navigating the twisting blue corridors hidden beneath the surface. They pressed microphones against the ice, listening for vibrations or sound pockets. They lowered cameras into crevasses using ropes, scanning for movement, collapsed snow bridges, or equipment wedged in narrow chambers. The cameras descended until the ropes ran out, swinging in the cold, dark void, but every screen showed the same thing: empty blackness. Thermal imaging drones came next. These machines could detect heat signatures even through thick ice layers, sometimes up to 15 feet deep. The drones swept the glacier in grid formations, capturing thousands of images. Specialists sat in portable monitoring tents, scanning every frame, hoping for a shape, a shadow, a cluster of colors that might indicate human presence. but the glacier registered only as a vast, unbroken field of cold. The absence of equipment began troubling experts as much as the missing people themselves. Even in the worst glacier accidents, where victims fell hundreds of feet, searchers usually recovered something: a torn jacket caught on an edge, a broken pole lying near a fracture, a crampon spike lodged in the ice. These objects became markers, clues, proof of where a fall occurred. But in this case, investigators couldn't find even a scrap of fabric or a sliver of metal. It was statistically improbable. One rescuer later said that losing 6 people was tragic, but losing every piece of gear they carried was almost impossible. During interviews at the base lodge, staff recounted the routine of every guided hike. The guide checked the group out, logged the time, confirmed the weather report, and headed out. He was known for sticking to procedure without shortcuts, and on that day, he did everything by the book right, until the moment he failed to sign back in. His absence might have been the most unsettling detail of all. Guides were required to check in even if the group arrived late or conditions shifted. His missing signature meant one thing: whatever happened occurred before he made it back to the lodge. Still, there was one more detail that stuck with investigators, a small moment buried in early interviews. Another hiking group had been on the glacier earlier that same afternoon. They were farther east, but within the same general region. Around the time the American sisters and the others vanished, these hikers reported faint shouting, echoing voices that didn't sound like normal conversation. They described them as distant, distorted, and impossible to place. Rescuers, however, couldn't confirm the direction. Sound traveled strangely on the glacier. A shout might bounce between walls of ice, making it appear to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. When search teams examined the area the hikers indicated, they still found nothing. Days passed. More crews flew in from different parts of Iceland. Winter conditions were approaching, and everyone understood that time was running out. Snowfall would soon bury small clues permanently. Ice would thicken, meltwater channels would shift. If they didn't find something soon, the glacier would hide whatever happened until nature decided to give it back, if it ever did. But even with increased manpower, the search made no progress. Every lead ended in blank ice. Every theory collapsed under its own gaps. By the third week, the mood among rescuers had changed. The urgency had faded into a quiet, exhausted determination. Rescuers spoke in low voices, trading glances that hinted at disbelief. They weren't just searching for people anymore. They were searching for logic, something to make sense of the silence the glacier kept offering back. Families of the missing pushed the authorities relentlessly. The American parents asked for deeper drilling, requesting that the glacier be penetrated at multiple points. The German relatives insisted the couple must have entered a crevasse farther east than the guide intended. The Japanese embassy submitted a formal appeal for extended scanning of the southern ice flows. But deeper drilling came with real dangers. Moulins often sat above unstable water channels. One misjudged drill could cause a collapse, putting rescuers at risk. And by late autumn, the weather was turning. Snowstorms grew more frequent. Wind speeds climbed. Ice bridges that had been stable weeks earlier began cracking under temperature shifts. In December, the rescue command was forced to make a decision. Continuing the search through winter was too dangerous, too unpredictable. Everyone understood this, but it didn't make the final announcement any easier. When the operation officially shifted from rescue to recovery, families reacted with grief that felt heavier than acceptance. Recovery implied that something, anything, would eventually be found. But the glacier had offered no such promise. Authorities privately discussed their theories among themselves, with more honesty than they could offer the public. Some believed the group had stepped onto a snow-covered crevasse that collapsed instantly, swallowing them whole. The weight of 6 people falling at once could have sealed the walls behind them, leaving no mark visible from the surface. They imagined a vertical drop, bodies and gear hurtling into a tight chamber and disappearing beneath tons of shifting ice. It was the kind of scenario that required almost perfect timing, rare but not impossible. But even that explanation didn't fully settle the questions. It didn't account for the missing equipment. It didn't address the lack of a single surface disturbance. And it didn't explain the faint shouting heard by the other hiking group. Rescuers who had worked glacier incidents for decades said quietly among themselves that they had never seen a disappearance like this. One officer later described it as the glacier closing over them instantly like a door slamming shut, but admitted that nature didn't usually erase people so cleanly. As winter settled in, the glacier became a place no one could safely enter. Snow hardened over fractures, new crevasses formed under fresh layers. The surface shifted subtly but constantly, and whatever lay beneath, if anything was there at all, was being pressed, carried, and buried deeper each day. The families returned home with unanswered questions and empty hands. They tried to hold on to hope, but even hope felt thin against a landscape that gave back nothing. Months passed, then a year. Tourists returned to the region, but locals avoided certain ridges. Guides still mentioned the disappearance, lowering their voices as if the glacier itself might be listening. The case settled into a quiet place in Icelandic history, unsolved, unsettling, and strangely incomplete. No one said it out loud, but the people who had searched the ice knew the truth. If the glacier had taken them, it would keep them until it chose not to. And no one could predict when that moment would come. But nearly a decade later, it finally did. And when scientists examined what emerged from the melting ice, their discovery would unravel everything investigators thought they understood. 9 years is a long time for a mystery to stay alive, especially one buried inside a glacier. Yet in Iceland, people still spoke about the 5 tourists who vanished on a clear afternoon, swallowed by a landscape that was supposed to be predictable. In the beginning, the case drew international attention. Reporters crowded the base lodges, foreign crews filmed documentaries, experts speculated on every possible scenario. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world's attention shifted to newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. The disappearance became something locals mentioned in quiet conversations, usually when pointing toward the ice fields and explaining to visitors that some places never give back what they take. The families had no such luxury of forgetting. They lived inside that wound every single day, waiting for something, a clue, a shard of gear, a discovery that never came. With each passing season, the glacier continued its slow descent toward the valley. It groaned and shifted, grinding rock into powder, spitting out meltwater as old layers pressed upward and broke apart. Occasionally, climbers or scientists would report odd findings along the glacier's edge: an old climbing boot from the 1972, a rusted ice axe, even fragments of a wool jacket likely belonging to a hiker who vanished decades before. The ice was known for returning the past at its own pace, slowly, unpredictably. Yet never once did it offer anything connected to the 5 missing tourists. Not a torn glove, not a scrap of nylon, not even a piece of metal from crampons or hiking poles. In a place that constantly shed its secrets, their total absence became its own chilling statement. Glaciologists struggled privately with the contradictions. They knew the glacier's internal structure changed every year, with pockets of meltwater carving unpredictable channels through the ice before refreezing overnight. But the year the disappearance occurred had been uniquely unstable. A climatology team published a paper suggesting that an unusual sequence of warm spells, followed by sudden freezes, could have created enormous hollow chambers deep within the glacier chambers, large enough to swallow not just a person, but an entire group, without leaving surface collapse patterns. The theory gained quiet traction among experts, but even those who believed it admitted it didn't explain everything. The lack of debris still made no sense. The absence of sound or detectable movement during the initial search made no sense. And the guide's silence, no radio calls, no distress signal, haunted everyone. Meanwhile, the families of the missing clung to their memories in different ways. Some withdrew from public life entirely. The married couple from Germany had 2 sons back home, both teenagers at the time of the disappearance, now young men who rarely spoke of their parents. The sons attended the memorials each year, standing apart from the group, holding candles they never lit. The solo Japanese traveler's parents came only once, in the 2nd year, then stopped returning, unable to bear the sight of the glacier that had taken their daughter. But one person never missed a single anniversary: the mother of the 2 American sisters. Every year, on the same date, at the same hour, she flew to Iceland and made the drive to the glacier's base lodge. Locals grew accustomed to her presence, watching her walk slowly across the same ridgeline officers had searched years before. She never cried in public. She rarely spoke. She would just stand in the wind, facing the endless white, as if listening for something only she could hear. Guides often offered to accompany her farther up the trail, but she always declined. She wasn't there to explore. She was there to confront the one place she couldn't bring herself to enter, the deep solitude of not knowing what happened to her daughters. By the 7th year, the yearly memorials had dwindled. What had once been a large gathering with cameras and journalists became a quiet circle of locals, rescue volunteers, and a few tourists who respected the loss even if they didn't know the details. It seemed inevitable that interest would eventually fade completely until a documentary aired on European television in the 9th year. It was a low-budget production, stitched together from old interviews, glacier footage, and speculative commentary from experts who hadn't been involved in the original search. Yet somehow, it struck a nerve. Maybe it was the haunting recreations, or the stark images of the glaciers swallowing daylight, or the way the narrator emphasized the strangeness of the group's complete disappearance. Whatever the reason, it revived public fascination with the case, and reignited something within the scientific community too. A group of researchers, climatologists, glaciologists, and a few engineers specializing in radar imaging proposed an expedition to scan deeper layers of the glacier than ever before. Their goal wasn't necessarily to find the missing tourists, but to understand the internal structures that had made the disappearance so baffling. The new radar units they planned to use were far more advanced than the technology available 9 years earlier. These devices could map not just crevasses and air pockets, but irregularities inside the ice itself, detecting shapes, densities, and even objects several hundred feet below the surface. Funding for the expedition came faster than expected. Some donors were scientists intrigued by the glacial anomalies. Others were families of the missing, hoping for closure. And then there were those who simply felt compelled by the lingering mystery, a puzzle that had resisted every attempt to solve it. By late spring, the team was assembled, equipped, and ready to begin. The expedition began quietly, without the media presence that surrounded the original search. Over the course of several days, the team scanned section after section of the glacier, painstakingly logging data, reviewing radar feedback, and cross-referencing anomalies. Most readings were exactly what they expected: refrozen melt pockets, compressed snow layers, and vertical cracks that appeared and disappeared depending on the glacier's shifting weight. But occasionally, the radar registered something odd, irregular densities that didn't match natural formations. These anomalies were small, scattered, and meaningless on their own. The team ignored them at first, chalking them up to radar interference or minor mineral inclusions. As they moved farther south, into areas where the glacier had advanced significantly since the disappearance, the readings grew stranger. Several deep anomalies appeared, clustered together, all embedded far below the modern surface, all too symmetrical to be natural. At first glance, the data was inconclusive. Radar could be unpredictable, especially in ice layers affected by years of freeze-thaw cycles. Yet the shapes didn't behave like ordinary distortions. They were too defined, too solid. One researcher compared them to silhouettes trapped in amber, blurred by time but unmistakably intentional. The team rescanned the area at multiple angles, recalibrating the equipment to eliminate false readings. But the anomalies remained stubbornly consistent. The formations were elongated, clustered in a pattern that resembled positioning rather than randomness. They weren't geological structures, nor were they air pockets created by meltwater, and they were located at a depth that aligned almost perfectly with where the group would have been carried if they had fallen into a vertical shaft and drifted south inside the glacier for 9 years. For the first time since the disappearance, the data suggested the presence of something or someone inside the ice. The researchers gathered around the radar screen, studying the cluster of irregular shapes with a mixture of disbelief and cautious dread. These weren't natural formations. They weren't random distortions. They weren't geological accidents. They were something else entirely, embedded deep enough to remain hidden for nearly a decade, yet intact enough to cast shadows through layers of compressed ice. And as the radar swept across the ice one final time, the outlines sharpened just enough for the team to understand what they were looking at: 5 shapes suspended in the glacier, arranged in a formation that could only be described as human. The discovery hit the team in absolute silence. the kind that settles when a mystery begins to pull itself out of the dark. For 9 years, the glacier had kept its secrets buried. Yet now, just beneath the surface of the ancient ice, something unmistakable had finally begun to emerge. And whatever it wasn't natural. They began drilling just after sunrise, when the glacier was at its quietest. The expedition team had learned to distinguish between normal groans of shifting ice and the warning cracks that meant they needed to stop. That morning, however, the glacier felt strangely still, as if it were holding something under the surface. The radar anomalies were too symmetrical to ignore, clustered together in ways that didn't match natural formations or trapped boulders. Most of the crew expected old equipment from decades-old climbs, maybe remnants of early survey stations lost during storms. Nobody expected anything recent, and certainly nothing linked to a disappearance everyone had quietly agreed would never be solved. The drill bit chewed through layer after layer, each core sample coming up with the same predictable signatures of compressed snow and ancient ice. But at a depth far below where any scientist believed human-made objects should ever appear, the machine shuddered with a resistance that did not feel geological. The crew paused. One of the glaciologists leaned in, studying the readout. There was an object below soft enough to deform under pressure, but rigid in places. Something that was not ice. When they raised the next cylinder, a silence settled over the ridge. Encased inside the core was a strip of fabric blue, with stitching still intact, shockingly preserved. Even under the harsh morning light, the color looked fresh, almost new. One of the researchers recognized the texture instantly. Modern outdoor material, the kind used in insulated jackets, the kind the missing tourists had been wearing 9 years earlier. The team didn't speak for several seconds. Their breaths clouded the air, forming a single drifting veil between them and the discovery. Finding a fabric this deep should have been impossible. The glacier had advanced nearly 2 kilometers since the year the group vanished. Nothing from that era should have migrated to this depth, especially in a zone where no collapse or surface disturbance had ever been recorded. Yet the evidence was right there, frozen into the core like a message from a time no one could account for. They drilled again, slowly, carefully, widening the borehole around the anomaly. More fragments surfaced. A shredded seam, a metal rivet, then a small, curved frame that looked unmistakably like part of a crampon. The metal showed no rust, no exposure, no grinding from long-distance transport inside the glacier. It looked almost untouched, as if it had been placed gently into the ice rather than crushed or dragged by movement. That detail alone unsettled everyone. The items appeared in a tight cluster, not scattered as they should have been if the group had fallen into a crevasse or been carried by shifting ice. Instead, everything in the cores suggested intentional proximity, as though the equipment had remained exactly where the people had been standing. The deeper they drilled, the clearer the pattern became. The objects weren't drifting. They were arranged. A growing unease spread through the team. Not fear, exactly, but an awareness that whatever they were uncovering didn't fit with any known model of glacier movement. Even the most chaotic collapses left directional signatures. Ice dragged, twisted, and buried things along predictable vectors. But this was different. The fragments formed a near-perfect circle just a few meters across, like a group huddling tightly together. One of the senior scientists stepped back, shaking his head. He had spent 3 decades mapping glaciers across the Arctic and had never seen a formation like this. Items shouldn't stay clustered across years of migration, not in this kind of turbulent ice. Yet here they were, as if the glacier had preserved a moment in time, intact, untouched, waiting. They widened the borehole again. More fragments surfaced, but what stunned the researchers most was a laminated sheet that came up curled around itself, edges bent but not torn. They knew immediately what it was before anyone spoke. The guide's route map. The same laminated chart he always carried, clipped to his pack. It shouldn't have survived. Laminate often cracked under intense pressure, and maps trapped inside glaciers tended to degrade into mush within months. Yet this one was recognizable. Entire sections of text were readable. If the map was here, then so was the guide. The realization washed over the team in slow, disbelieving waves. For years, investigators had theorized the guide might have separated from the group or gone for help. Others believed he slipped into a hidden crevasse while the tourists walked ahead. But here, the map lay within the same clustered zone as the clothing fragments and the crampon frame, meaning he hadn't left them. He had stayed with them to the end. The weight of that implication. Still, the greatest question remained unresolved. How did all these items end up so deep within the glacier, in a section that had not been accessible during the year of the disappearance? This zone had been buried beneath solid, compacted ice for decades. Geological charts confirmed that no natural opening, cave system, or melt channel had existed at that depth at the time. There was simply no explanation for why the group's belongings would be found here unless the glacier had somehow swallowed them whole instantly, cleanly, without leaving a trace on the surface. But even that theory faltered. An immediate collapse large enough to consume 6 adults would have left measurable signatures on the surface: sinkholes, fractures, or compression ridges. Search teams 9 years ago had found nothing. As the researchers continued analyzing the anomaly field, more patterns emerged. The objects were all oriented inward, facing the same direction. It looked less like items dropped during a fall, and more like remnants of people who had gathered closely, possibly kneeling or sitting. The idea of an enclosed chamber resurfaced, echoing the climatology paper published years earlier, the one suggesting that unusual melt-freeze cycles might have created unstable caverns inside the glacier. But that paper had only proposed temporary hollow spaces, nothing like a permanent cave, and nothing vast enough to conceal 6 people for nearly a decade without collapsing in on itself. Even if such a chamber had existed, how would the group have reached it? No entrance to that depth existed anywhere near the last confirmed coordinates of their tour. The terrain was flat, safe, frequently traveled by guides and tourists alike. Search teams had surveyed every meter within kilometers. Not once had they detected subterranean voids or fresh crevasse openings. The more the scientists studied the evidence, the more the mystery expanded rather than contracted. Late in the afternoon, after almost 12 hours of drilling, the glaciologists gathered for an emergency review of the data. Sunlight thinned across the snowfield, casting long stretches of shadow across the equipment. The air temperature dropped rapidly, causing their breath to thicken and hover. They spread the fragments on a sterile canvas sheet, their colors stark against the white surface. The jackets, the crampon frame, the laminated map, all preserved, all clustered, all impossibly deep. One of the younger researchers asked the question no one had dared voice. If they were together, then why didn't anything drift apart over 9 years? The lead scientist didn't answer. He only stared at the pattern of fragments, his expression darkening with the implications. Because the glacier would only preserve an arrangement like that if the objects had been sealed instantly, not over hours, not even over minutes. Somehow, the group had been encapsulated within seconds, locked into place before the ice could crush or distort their positions. A freeze event that rapid would require an extreme, localized temperature drop or a sudden flooding of meltwater that solidified in an unnatural way. But nothing in the recorded climate data from that year supported such an event. As dusk crept over the field, the team prepared to pack up their findings and return to the base camp to send core samples for lab analysis. But before shutting down the machinery, one scientist suggested lowering a fiber optic camera into the borehole. Even a partial visual might clarify whether the anomalies were objects or something more. The camera descended slowly, spiraling downward through the drilled shaft. Static obscured the view at first, then the feed cleared. Ice layers glowed pale blue under the camera light. Deeper still, frost crystals glimmered like suspended dust. For several long seconds, nothing appeared unusual. Then the camera passed a horizontal fissure, a thin crack running across the chamber. Below it, the ice changed. It was no longer the typical compressed layers of ancient snowfall. The texture looked smoother, almost polished, as though it had melted and refrozen at a single moment. And embedded within that refrozen mass, arranged in a ring, were unmistakable shapes, dark outlines. Some small, some larger, all tightly grouped, not scattered, not twisted, not broken, just frozen in place, exactly where they had been in their final moments. The room above the borehole fell silent. The outlines weren't natural debris. They were not rocks, or ancient tools, or air bubbles trapped in the ice over decades. They were the silhouettes of people, 5 clustered together in one tight formation, and one slightly apart, as if positioned between them and something unseen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind outside had gone still. The shapes were too clear to misinterpret. They had not fallen. They had not scattered. They had been waiting. The melt excavation took far longer than the team expected. What began as a narrow borehole widened through weeks of controlled thermal drilling, each pass of the equipment carving away layers that had sealed themselves like armor over nearly a decade. Every scientist working on the project carried a quiet tension. None of them said it aloud, but they all felt they were inching towards something heavier than simple physical evidence. The deeper the excavation went, the more the glacier behaved strangely, with pockets of ice that refroze faster than the machinery could melt them, and layers that shifted just enough to make the crew step back and reassess. It felt as if the glacier was both revealing and resisting at the same time, forcing them to earn every centimeter. When they finally reached the anomaly zone, the drill broke through into empty space. The sound of it was unmistakable. A hollow drop in pressure followed by a soft groan rising from beneath the surface. The team shut down the machinery instantly. It was too dangerous to continue melting blindly. Instead, they inserted a telescopic probe into the narrow break. The feed showed smooth, curving walls of translucent ice walls that had clearly formed within a single freezing event, not tens or hundreds of years of compression. There was no debris, no rock, no sediment, just a pristine interior sealed in every direction, and in the center of that cavity lay the truth no one had imagined. It was a vertical ice chamber, taller than a person, no wider than a small room. The shape suggested a temporary void created by a warm pocket of air or water that had surged through the glacier 9 years earlier, carving a hidden cylinder before refreezing almost instantly. It shouldn't have existed for long, and yet it had survived just long enough to entomb the group inside. The scientists didn't know it at first, but they had found the exact environment the missing tourists had been trapped in during their final hours. When the team lowered the interior platform for the first physical entry, the air inside felt impossibly cold, even by glacier standards. It wasn't the kind of cold that struck the skin immediately. It was the kind that seemed to vibrate out from the walls themselves, as though the chamber retained the last memory of the people who had stood there. The space was barely large enough for 6 adults to gather tightly. Along the lower half of the icy walls, the researchers found smudges, thin, elongated patterns where the ice had been touched repeatedly. They looked like handprints, though blurred from decades of refreezing and compression. When they mapped the smudges under ultraviolet light, the pattern became unmistakable. They were fingerprints. Not the chaotic streaks of panic or flailing, not the desperate scrapes left by someone clawing at solid ice. These prints were deliberate, placed evenly around the chamber, as though the group had positioned themselves with intention, trying to make the space organized, maybe even safe. The tourists hadn't spiraled into hysteria. They had handled the walls calmly. Someone had guided them. Someone had told them where to sit, how to stay close, how to conserve warmth. The prints were not the marks of chaos. They were the marks of people trying to survive. Further up the chamber walls, another set of impressions told a different part of the story. Overhead, angled gouges cut through the ice ceiling deep, jagged lines created by a metal tool repeatedly driven upward. The team identified the pattern quickly. Crampons. The guide had likely removed one from his boot and used it like a pickaxe, aiming for a point of weakness he must have sensed or hoped was thinner. The grooves were spaced in a way that echoed exhaustion. Long attempts early on, shorter, weaker ones later. Every swing left a mark, but none had broken through the top layer. At some point, the ice had simply refrozen around his efforts, sealing them inside. It wasn't a sudden collapse like many had theorized, back when the group first vanished. It wasn't an instant burial or a catastrophic accident. The chamber's interior layers revealed a slow drowning in cold, 1 centimeter at a time. Meltwater had poured in from above or the side, likely triggered by an unusual thermal cycle, then refroze at the same speed, locking the cavity into a perfect vertical cell. Instead of crushing the chamber or leaving jagged edges, the ice had smoothed itself like blown glass. The group must have realized the moment the space sealed around them that it would only get smaller, colder, darker. Scientists estimating the collapse rate concluded something chilling. The group had been alive for hours, possibly a full day, enough time to feel the temperature drop beyond what any human body could fight. Enough time for the guide to attempt a dozen plans, each weaker than the last. Enough time for someone to whisper, someone to cry, someone to beg for a signal from outside that would never arrive. Enough time for people who had met only that morning to become the last witnesses to one another's lives. Near the chamber's northern wall, a heap of preserved fragments caught the team's attention. Among the scattered items was a small handheld audio recorder, one of the cheap tourist models that hikers often carried for documenting their trips. The casing had cracked from pressure, but the memory chip inside had survived. When the research staff realized what they had found, no one touched it for several long seconds. The idea of hearing something recorded inside the chamber felt almost too heavy to confront. Back at base camp, they extracted the audio carefully, transferring the fragments onto a secure drive. Most of it was static, long stretches of nothing but wind distortion from the device being jostled at some point during the entrapment. But then, beneath the interference, a faint human sound emerged, a breath, uneven and shaky. Then another, softer, almost indistinguishable. The audio tech working on the file froze when he realized the breaths were not echoes or artifacts. They were real. The room filled as more of the team gathered. A faint scrape sounded next, likely the recorder shifting against ice. Then something even more faint, almost inaudible words spoken near the microphone, in a soft, strained whisper. German. Only part of the sentence could be restored. The rest had fallen into digital decay from years of pressure. But the phrase they recovered was enough to silence every conversation in the room. Es tut mir leid. Ich dachte, I'm sorry, I thought. The team debated whether it came from one of the tourists or from the guide, who was Icelandic but fluent in German from his years leading tours. No one could be certain, but the tone carried a bleak resignation, the type that only surfaces when someone realizes the outcome cannot be changed. A partial apology, a broken explanation, a moment of human truth sealed into ice for nearly a decade. The audio ended with a long, slow exhale, followed by the recorder's battery fading into silence. As the reality settled in, the researchers realized they weren't simply holding physical evidence anymore. They were holding the last breath of 6 people who had vanished into pure mystery. For years, their disappearance had been framed as another tragic misstep on dangerous terrain, a puzzling but distant event. But now, the truth felt unbearably close. These were not ghost stories or theories debated in documentary forums. These were real people whose final moments had played out in a silent, lightless prison beneath the moving glacier. The weight of the discovery changed everyone in the room. Some of the scientists stepped outside, overcome by the idea that the families would soon hear this recording. Others stayed behind, staring at the waveform on the monitor as if trying to decode emotions that no machine could capture. They had uncovered the chamber, mapped the prints, traced the final attempts at escape, and heard the last spoken sentence from within that frozen tomb. And as overwhelming as it was, one truth pressed itself into their minds more heavily than anything else. For 9 years, the glacier had kept those final moments sealed, untouched, unheard, unseen. And now, for the first time, the world would hear exactly what it sounded like when the group realized no rescue was coming. And somewhere beneath the remaining layers, deeper in the ice they had yet to excavate, the bodies themselves were still waiting to be found. The truth did not arrive with dramatic music, flashing lights, or a sudden breakthrough. It came quietly, almost humbly, during the final hours of an excavation that had already stretched far longer than anyone expected. The glacier stood before the team like a wounded giant, scarred by weeks of drilling, probing, and cutting, but still indifferent, still ancient, still holding secrets that had refused to surface for nearly a decade. For 9 years, families, scientists, and search teams had been haunted by the disappearance of 5 hikers whose last known steps vanished into the blue-white expanse of an alpine glacier. Now, with the chamber finally open, the story of what happened to them was starting to speak, not in words, but in layers of ice, shifts of temperature, and eerie geological logic that no one could emotionally prepare for. The final excavation team had expected debris, maybe fragments of gear, maybe clothing fibers, maybe something the sun had exposed along the thinning edge. They did not expect a perfectly preserved timeline frozen into place like a last photograph. It started with subtle details. Ice that looked oddly layered, as if it had sealed itself twice. Pockets of compressed snow that shouldn't have been there after 9 years. The shape of a shaft that looked less like erosion and more like collapse. Every sign pointed toward the same conclusion, but no one dared say it aloud. The truth was forming, but it was almost too heartbreaking to accept. As the chamber opened fully and the cold breath of the glacier exhaled into the warm air of late summer, investigators stepped inside with the reverence of entering a tomb. The bodies of the 5 missing hikers lay exactly where they had fallen, arranged not by human hands but by the geometry of the glacier's slow, relentless movement. Their clothing was intact, colors muted by the frost but unmistakably theirs. Their packs were still strapped to their backs or pinned beneath arms that had frozen mid-motion. Their expressions, softened by time, told a story far quieter and far more tragic than anyone had imagined during those frantic early days of the search in 2014. Using laser imaging and 3D mapping, the scientific team reconstructed the chamber's interior and, with it, the group's final path. That was when the truth emerged fully, and no one could hide from it anymore. The hikers had not ventured recklessly off trail. They had not attempted a dangerous crossing. They had not misread their maps or ignored warnings. Instead, they had stepped onto what appeared to be a harmless patch of snow. A fragile ice bridge formed just hours earlier when an unusual spike in temperature caused meltwater to refreeze across a deep vertical shaft. It had looked solid. It had sounded solid. It had carried the weight of the first person who stepped onto it. But when the full group crossed in a tight line, the entire bridge collapsed beneath them. The shaft dropped nearly 20 meters straight down into a temporary chamber carved by earlier meltwater flows. The fall had stunned them, injured some of them, but not immediately killed them. The forensics team determined that 3 of the hikers had initially survived the fall, with injuries ranging from broken ribs to a shattered wrist. The other 2 had suffered more severe trauma, and then, within minutes, no more than 5 or 6, according to temperature modeling and ice formation patterns, the surface collapsed again above them. The opening sealed shut, erasing any sign of their fall. Fresh snow, drifting from the afternoon winds, covered the collapse almost instantly. By the time search teams arrived the next morning, the glacier looked untouched, smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened at all. This truth struck every expert at the site with the same sickening realization. No one could have found them back then. Not even with drones, not even with a full ground-penetrating radar sweep. The glacier had sealed itself like a wound closing, hiding the hikers in a pocket of ice that would drift deeper and deeper into its core as the years passed. From 2014 to 2023, the glacier moved nearly 40 meters southward, dragging the trapped chamber along with it. Seasonal pressure compressed the ice around them, shaping the pocket like a capsule. By the time natural erosion thinned the glacier enough to reveal the edge of the chamber 9 years later, the hikers were no longer lost. They were simply waiting to be seen. Scientists had theorized for years that glaciers could swallow and later return objects with eerie precision. Lost boots, century-old rifles, even entire aircraft. But never had there been such a complete, untouched preservation of a human event. This chamber was not just a resting place, it was a timeline, frozen at the exact moment hope still flickered inside. Every item, every posture, every detail told the story of the group's final hours. One hiker had moved toward the narrow upper slope of the chamber, perhaps attempting to climb out before fatigue or injury stopped him. Another had sat with her back against the icy wall, head tilted toward the others, as if listening. 2 packs had been opened, likely in an attempt to gather tools or food. And at the center of it all, a small handheld recorder lay half buried in the snow. Its red light had frozen mid-blink. Its battery was long dead, but the device had remained sealed enough to preserve a final audio file. When the recorder was recovered and analyzed in a controlled environment, specialists expected ambient noise, maybe wind, maybe the faint crackle of ice settling. Instead, they found something that stunned every person who heard it. A voice. Quiet. Steady. almost whispered. A man, speaking in German, "Wir warten zusammen." The translation was simple, but its impact was devastating. We wait together. There were no screams, no panic, no pleas for help. Just a message of comfort or resignation, or both. A final attempt to keep the group calm as darkness closed in and the temperature dropped. Audio experts debated whether the phrase represented hope, encouraging the group to stay united until rescue came, or acceptance, acknowledging that they may not live to see daylight again. Either way, the voice carried a softness that shook even the most experienced investigators. It was the sound of a human being trying to shield others from fear in a place where fear would have been overwhelming. As the truth unfolded, the families of the 5 hikers gathered near the excavation site. They had lived 9 years in a fog of uncertainty, years filled with false leads, rumors, and theories that had stretched from the logical to the fantastical. Some had believed the group died in a crevasse. Others thought they may have fallen into a hidden cave system. A few had held on to hope that perhaps they somehow survived and were living in isolation. And in darker moments, some wondered if foul play had been involved. The unknown had twisted their grief into something shapeless, something heavy that followed them through their daily lives. Now the truth sat before them, quiet and undeniable. Their children, their siblings, their partners had not suffered through betrayal or abandonment or cruelty. They had not been reckless or foolish. They had stepped onto a piece of ice that nature had disguised so perfectly that no one, not even a trained mountaineer, could have recognized the danger. They had been swallowed by a force older and stronger than any human instinct. The remains were removed with meticulous care, each body lifted from the chamber with a reverence that bordered on ceremonial. The forensic team worked in near silence, interrupted only by the wind moving across the glacier's surface. Identification was completed through preserved clothing, dental records, and, in 2 cases, fingerprints still intact from the extraordinary preservation conditions. Recovery vans arrived one by one, carrying the hikers down the mountain and ending a 9-year mystery that had stretched across entire communities. Scientists stood beside rescuers as the final reports were read aloud at the site. Some wiped their eyes. Others stared into the exposed chamber, unable to comprehend how something so fragile, a spike in temperature lasting barely 3 hours, a thin sheet of refrozen meltwater, could alter so many lives so permanently. Rescue workers who had spent weeks searching in 2014 felt the weight of understanding settle heavily on their shoulders. They had been right there, on the same glacier, miles of ice away from the trapped hikers. They had walked over the very spot where the collapse had occurred, unaware that the tragedy lay sealed beneath their boots. As sunlight moved across the glacier's face, turning the exposed ice into a shifting pattern of blues and golds, the families stood together in a quiet circle. No one spoke. There were no dramatic gestures, no outpourings of emotion, just a long, shared silence that felt sacred. Some placed their hands on the rope line marking the edge of the excavation. Others lowered their heads. A few simply looked into the distance, absorbing the weight of the truth. The most haunting realization was not how the group died, but how they lived in their final hours together, united, refusing to abandon hope even as the glacier sealed above them. The recorder's message echoed through the minds of everyone present. We wait together. It was a statement of unity, of courage, of fragile humanity inside a frozen world that cared nothing for human time. In the end, the glacier that had taken them became the glacier that returned them, delivering a story no one could fully comprehend until they saw it with their own eyes. The timeline was complete. The mystery solved. Closure, in its quiet, heavy form, had finally arrived. And as the families walked away from the site, one truth lingered in the cold air behind them, a truth that left everyone speechless. The hikers had never stopped hoping. They had never been alone. They had waited, together, inside the glacier that